Welcome back to Devil in a Small Town. In our last episode, we witnessed the investigation intensify as the race against time became more pressing. Now, in this episode, we're on the verge of a major revelation that could bring clarity to the mystery. Detective Bowen and his partner race back to Goshen to relay the information about their trip and share the shocking evidence. Meanwhile, back in Goshen, the rest of his team is working tirelessly, trying to connect the last remaining dots in the investigation. The town is holding its breath, hoping for answers. As the investigation reaches its peak, a breakthrough comes, a significant piece of evidence that brings us closer to understanding what happened to Julia Crawford. The note that Detective Bowen had found under the bookshelf at the house. Detective Bowen pulls out his phone and takes a picture of the list of names. He decides to send it to a friend of his in the FBI to run through their database. He wants to get as much information as possible before revealing the evidence to the rest of the task force. In need of a shower and some rest, Bowen decides to go home while he waits for the results. After freshening up, he sits down at his dining room table and sets the note down and grabs his pad of paper. He closes his eyes and replays everything he saw in the basement of Lawson's property, jotting down every detail he can think of. On the edge of sleep, he takes a drink of water and picks up the note to take a closer look. And in that moment, he sees something that could lead to the biggest break in the case yet. Later, Detective Bowen walks into the station, unnoticed at first. Everyone was so focused on working different angles of the case, it was as if Jack was a ghost and no one could see him. He stood silent for a moment, before banging on the closest desk until everyone looked up and noticed him. He cleared his throat and said that he had found something big. They went to Mr. Lawson's property, and at first it seemed to be empty, but upon further investigation, they found that the cellar door was open. The room fell silent as every officer focuses their attention on Detective Bowen. Everyone listens intently as he tells the story of the house and what he witnessed. Bowen finishes retelling the events of their day all the way up to the point where he heard voices and had to escape. The room erupted with discussion between the officers. The detective quiets the station and regains their attention. Slowly, he pulls the folded paper out of his pocket and holds it in the air. There is a thick air of anticipation in the room as everyone stares at this paper. Bowen clears his throat again and says that on this paper was a list of names. The night before he couldn't sleep, so he reached out to an FBI friend to have him run the list of names through their database. It turns out, every name on the list is a young female that disappeared between the ages of 16 and 18. And they had all been reported as missing under unusual circumstances. The real clue, however, came when they noticed that someone had written a note on the back of the paper. Detective Bowen turns the paper over, revealing the handwritten note smeared in red ink, or so they thought. An officer in the back of the room asked what the note said, for he couldn't see it from where he was standing. Bowen told him it simply said, "Please help me." But that wasn't the interesting part. He stared at that note for hours the previous night and couldn't make sense of it. Questions raced through his mind over and over again. Who wrote it? Was it one of the victims? Where did the ink come from? Jack relayed to them how he had taken a drink of water and then picked the note back up. And it was then that he noticed that the moisture from his hand from the glass had caused some of the ink to rub off on his thumb. And it was then that he realized it wasn't ink, it was blood. With only 24 hours to go before the ceremony, the police force must work quickly to resolve the case. We last left Detective Bowen standing in front of the entire Goshen police force, holding a piece of paper with "Please help me" and what was thought to be red ink, until he discovered it was actually blood. Jack tells them that he ran by the lab earlier that morning and had the blood analyzed. After a couple hours, the lab got a hit. He said this is where it gets interesting. It turns out that the blood on the note belongs to none other than Miss Julia Crawford. One of the officers asked Bowen if he thinks that they might have Julia trapped at that house. Detective Bowen paused for a moment before answering that question. He took his handkerchief out and wiped the sweat off his forehead. He looked at the officer and told him that he honestly doesn't know. What he did know was that they're going to build a task force and that they would be there at that house tomorrow night, and they will stop the ceremony from happening. There will not be another victim to those psychopaths in robes. The police station erupts into action as everyone starts clearing out the conference room and wheeling empty corkboards and dry erase boards in. Within an hour, the conference room is filled with officers coordinating the raid that was going to go down in 18 hours. With a combined total of around 4 hours of sleep over the course of the last 2 days, it was starting to catch up with Detective Bowen. He sat in a chair in the corner of the conference room and slowly drifted off to sleep. Later, Detective Bowen opens his eyes slowly to see one of his fellow officers with a worried look on his face. As he regains his wits, he looks around the room and sees everyone is gearing up to begin the raid of the ceremony house. The officer that woke him up hands him a walkie-talkie and a bulletproof vest. The officer looks at him and says, "It's time, sir." The force loads up in their vans and move out towards the ceremony house. Their team surrounds the property and slowly starts working their way closer and closer to the house. The time is now 7:50. The ceremony will begin in 10 minutes. The task force enters the house. The team has been instructed to remain on radio silence until contact has been made. Through the mics, the control center can hear the muffled sounds of chanting and the ceremonial music. Detective Bowen suddenly has a flashback to the last time he was inside the house. He quickly brushes it off and continues behind the lead agent. He directs them down the hallway that slopes deeper and deeper into the earth, and as they get closer, the chanting and the music grows louder. They reach the edge of the room and hold their positions. The seconds tick by like minutes in slow motion as Detective Bowen slowly counts down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. A flashbang grenade goes off and suddenly, "Go, go, go! Goshen PD! Hands in the air! Everyone, hands in the air now!" Blindfolded and in a trance, they found the same young girl that was talking to Marcus lying on the table with her hands and feet bound with rope. She had clearly been drugged because she never flinched during all of the commotion. For a brief second, Detective Bowen thought that they were too late, that the young girl might be dead, until she quietly moaned and moved slightly on the table, letting him know that she was still alive. As the EMTs rush in and tend to the girl, the officers gather everyone in robes off to the side of the room. They are all cuffed and lined up along the wall. One by one, Detective Bowen walks down the line, pulling hoods off of each person one at a time. Sarcastically, Bowen tells Mr. Crawford it's nice to see him again, and then discovers Marcus and introduces himself, knowing that Marcus had no clue who he was. Once Detective Bowen gets down the line, he gets to the last hood. He slowly reaches his hand up and hesitates for a moment. He has a gut feeling about this last hood. Something just seemed different. Slowly, he pulls the hood back and the face is revealed. A familiar face. Michael Roth. Shocked, Detective Bowen takes a step back and looks Roth straight in the eye. A slight grin slowly begins to form on his face as he looks back at Detective Bowen. Through his curled lips, he mutters the words, "Surprise, Detective. I'm guessing you didn't expect to see me here." Jack slams him against the wall and gets in his face, demanding to know where Julia is. A fellow officer pulls him back as he regains his composure. He slowly pulls the paper out of his pocket and shows it to Mr. Roth. His grin has now turned into a full smile. Detective Bowen could see the evil in his eyes as he glared back at Mr. Roth. Roth tells Jack that he'll start off from the beginning, but before he could get a single word out, Richard Crawford screams at him to keep his mouth shut. Roth chuckles and tells Richard it's a little too late for that. He begins telling the story again. Julia had been Richard's puppet for years. After they got married, he introduced her to his dark secret. The Following of the Devil Spawn is an organization that has been around for centuries. They sacrifice young virgins to make sure they are successful in life. It's a penance to the devil for the deal they made back in 1789. For every year they must sacrifice a virgin to the devil, and in return their lives are successful with more money and power than they could ever ask for. Jack had ruined this year's sacrifice, and now according to Roth, he will be cursed for the rest of his life. Detective Bowen was only concerned with one thing, and Roth didn't answer his question. Where is Julia? At this point, Bowen violently grabs both of Roth's shoulders and gets so close to his face that as he yells, drops of spit fly through the air onto Roth's face. Roth's smile grows even larger, like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. He looks down at Michael Crawford and nods. Crawford nods back. The others all exchange glances and nod as if they were silently agreeing on the same thing. Roth turns his head back and looks at Detective Bowen directly in the eyes and lets out an evil laugh, uttering his final words of, "Wouldn't you like to know what really happened to Julia? Too bad you never will." And then all at once, every Robe member down the line swished their mouths around, and one by one, they all started to foam at the mouth and collapse to the ground until no one was left but Roth. He takes one final look at Detective Bowen and shows a small capsule between his teeth. Before Detective Bowen can get his hand to Roth's mouth to stop him, he bites down on the capsule and within seconds starts to foam at the mouth and collapses to the ground. Cyanide pills, Bowen thinks to himself. He and the rest of the task force finish up at the crime scene and move into the rest of the house. They found many different ritualistic items and more ceremonial trinkets. Everything was taken back to the station and cataloged. Everyone makes their ways back home and finally gets some rest. Over the next few months, the small town of Goshen slowly returns to its peaceful charm. Residents still wonder who Julia really was and what really happened to her. But for Detective Bowen, this case had taken a serious toll. He nearly had a breakdown after obsessing over the fact that he couldn't gain closure for Julia's disappearance. It was an itch that he never could scratch. 2 years have passed since the night of the raid. Detective Bowen has finally come to terms with the fact that he may never know what truly happened to Julia Crawford. On the anniversary of that night, Detective Bowen returns to Julia's former house, the place where everything had began. He stands silently in front of her house and quietly whispers an apology to Julia for never finding her. After a moment of silence, he heads home to get something to eat and get some sleep. Detective Bowen pulls up to his house and sees that his door is slightly ajar. Slowly, he unclips his firearm and quietly tiptoes his way towards the door. Sweat is beginning to bead up on his forehead. A quick wipe with his sleeve takes care of that. Inching into the house with his firearm leading the way, Detective Bowen makes his way into the living room. Sitting in his chair was a figure in the same ceremonial robe. Frozen in disbelief, Detective Bowen stares at the robed figure, unable to take a breath, when suddenly, a female voice comes from under the hood.
"What's the matter, Detective? I thought you'd be happy to finally find me."
Slowly, the woman pulls back her hood and smiles a sinister grin and gives a nod to someone behind Detective Bowen. Before he can turn around to see another robed figure, a knife runs across his throat. Feeling his warm blood running down his own neck, Jack manages to utter his last dying word. In just a whisper, he says, "Julia." And so our story comes to an end. We've uncovered secrets, faced twists and turns, saved the life of an innocent young woman, and in the end, found Julia. Thank you for joining us on this journey. This has been Devil in a Small Town.